The .provider method is the most verbose and at the same time the most flexible method of creating services in Angular. Not only can you create a factory that's dynamically configurable at the time of using the factory, with the provider method, you could custom configure the factory just once at the bootstrapping of your entire application, and then use that factory throughout your application with your custom settings. In other words, you could configure this factory before your application starts. In fact, as the Angular documentation tells us, the provider method is what actually gets executed behind the scenes when we configure our services with either .service or .factory methods. Let's go over the steps of using the .provider method. The first step is to define the provider function. You'll notice that this is a special function that has a particular property on the actual instance of the function. Here you see that the var provider is equal to this, so therefore provider.$get, the $get property is a function that is directly attached to the provider instance. That function is a factory function. In other words, it's just like the one that we used to provide to the .factory method. In that function, you create your service. In our case, we're creating a new service called service. This $get property, that's a function, is what makes the provider a provider. AngularJS expects the provider to have a $get property whose value is a function that Angular will treat as a factory function. But what makes this whole setup very special is the fact that you could provide some config object inside the service provider, and that usually comes with defaults, that you can later override in the step where you configure the entire application, which we'll see in a minute. So in this case, we're saying provider.config, which means the config property again is sitting on the instance of service provider, and it's equals some object literal that, for example, can have a prop property in it. Step 2 is to register the provider function with the module. And the way you register the provider is very similar to the controller, the factory, and the service. You just say .provider, it's a method on the module instance, and you supply the name of the service that the provider will produce and the service provider function that has a $get as part of its properties. Now notice that the name that you're supplying in the provider function is the name of the service as it will be injected into other services, controllers, and so on. The name of the function or the service provider function does not matter at all. The third step is to inject our service just as usual. And you'll notice here that what we're injecting is we're injecting whatever the .provider defined name was, not the service provider function. Our .provider declared that we're going to have a service called service, and therefore what we're injecting is also called service. Well, so far we haven't really configured anything. So that's why we're in optional step number 4a. That is registering the config function. Now, config function is the special function that you can invoke on the module instance that is guaranteed to run before any services, factories, or controllers are even created. Which means that's a step for us to be able to tap into configuring these services before they're ever created. Now, the reason it's optional is because you don't have to configure it. You could just have the defaults take effect. However, for some services, there doesn't make any sense to have any type of defaults, so sometimes this is simply required by the business logic or particular service that needs to be configured. The optional step 4b is to actually define the config function. As you could see here, in defining the config function, we're injecting service provider into the config function. Now, we cannot inject any regular services into the config function simply because it gets executed before any services, factories, or controllers are even created. Therefore, what we need to do is get at the provider function of a particular service. And if the provider has been declared with a particular string, the thing that we inject into the config function is that string plus the string provider. So in this case, our provider has been declared with service. Therefore, what we inject into the config function and then use inside of it is service provider. Once again, the name of the actual provider function is completely irrelevant. Last but not least, we can then use the service provider instance to get at its properties like config and the config properties to go ahead and configure it for a particular application. Okay, so now that we went through the process, in part 2 of this lecture, let's get into the code editor and see how this works in action.